The material cultures of food and sustenance in Norse settlements reveals sophisticated adaptation to the island's resources. Excavated middens contain fish bones, showing targeted exploitation of cod, scythe, and ling, species that could be preserved through drying or salting for winter consumption and trade. Mammal bones indicate a preference for cattle and sheep over pigs, likely reflecting the suitability of these animals to island grazing conditions. Botanical remains show cultivation of barley as the primary grain crop, supplemented by smaller quantities of oats, and in some locations, flax for both fiber and oil. The discovery of specialized processing areas for these resources, butchery zones, fish processing stations, grain drying kilns, indicates organized production beyond immediate household consumption. Isotopic analysis of human remains from Norse burials confirms a diet rich in marine protein, distinguishing islanders from contemporaries on the Scottish mainland who relied more heavily on terrestrial resources. This dietary pattern created a distinctive nutritional profile that likely influenced health outcomes, with skeletal evidence suggesting generally adequate nutrition among the Norse population, despite the challenging northern environment. The social hierarchy within Norse communities was complex and evolved over time. At the apex stood the earl and prominent families connected to him by blood or alliance. Below them were landowners of varying wealth and status, from substantial farmers with multiple properties to those with just enough land to maintain independence. Many households included thralls, enslaved people captured in raids or purchased through trade networks, whose labor supported the agricultural and domestic activities of their owners. This institution of slavery, though commonplace in early medieval societies, represents one of the darker aspects of Norse culture. Archaeological evidence occasionally hints at this hierarchy. Differences in house size, grave goods, and diet quality reflect disparities in wealth and status that structured daily interactions. The Christianization process gradually modified this social structure, with church institutions offering new paths to status and the formal practice of slavery eventually declining, though significant social stratification persisted through different mechanisms. The later Scottish feudal influence further transformed social relationships, creating new categories of dependence and obligation that overlaid older Norse patterns. The psychological experience of the cultural transition, how individuals understood and internalized changing identities, remains largely inaccessible to direct historical investigation, but can be approached through careful consideration of material evidence and comparative anthropological models. For Pictish individuals who survived the initial Norse incursions and found themselves incorporated into the new social order, adaptation likely involved complex negotiations of identity, perhaps maintaining certain practices privately while publicly conforming to Norse expectations. For Norse settlers, the experience of establishing communities in new territories involved both maintaining connections to homeland traditions and adapting to unfamiliar environments. The gradual process of Christianization similarly required psychological adjustment as fundamental worldviews shifted. Later, as Scottish influence increased, island inhabitants again faced identity questions as political allegiance, language use, and cultural practices realigned. These psychological dimensions, though less visible in the archaeological record than material changes, represent crucial aspects of how historical transitions were experienced by the individuals who lived through them. The transmission of knowledge and skills across generations formed a crucial aspect of cultural continuity during periods of change. Craft specialization evidence from Norse settlements, metalworking debris, textile production tools, boat-building sites indicates organized systems for training new practitioners in complex technical traditions. These apprenticeship arrangements likely combined practical demonstration with oral instruction, creating chains of knowledge transmission that could persist for centuries. The introduction of Christianity eventually brought more formalized education for a small elite, primarily those destined for ecclesiastical careers, but most practical knowledge continued to circulate through direct training and observation. Place names preserved geographical knowledge, identifying particular resources, hazards, or landmarks in ways that guided spatial understanding across generations. Storytelling maintained historical awareness and reinforced community values, with sagas and local traditions creating shared narratives that positioned current inhabitants within longer temporal sequences. These knowledge transmission mechanisms allowed core cultural elements to persist, even as political arrangements, religious affiliations, and economic patterns changed. The experience of gender in Norse communities was structured by clear divisions of labor and authority, but showed more complexity in practice than simplified models might suggest. Men dominated public governance, warfare, and most long-distance activities, while women controlled domestic spaces, managed household resources, and supervised textile production. Archaeological evidence occasionally challenges these neat divisions. Some female graves contain items associated with trade or specialized craft production, suggesting broader economic roles for certain women than conventional narratives allow. The legal status of women, though certainly unequal to men, included specific protections and rights, with divorce possible under certain circumstances and property ownership accessible, particularly to widows. Elite women sometimes exercised significant informal power through kinship networks and alliance building, occasionally appearing in the sagas as influential behind-the-scenes figures shaping political outcomes. The Christian Church brought new ideological frameworks regarding gender, potentially restricting women's roles in some domains while offering new opportunities in others through religious vocations and charitable activities. Later Scottish influences further modified gender arrangements, though fundamental patterns of division persisted well into the modern era. The relationship with the sea fundamentally shaped Norse identity and practice in the islands. Maritime skills were not merely practical necessities, but central components of social status and cultural self-understanding. The ability to navigate challenging waters, predict weather patterns, locate fishing grounds, and maintain vessels represented highly valued knowledge transmitted through careful instruction across generations. Place names along coastlines preserved information about tidal patterns, underwater hazards, landing sites, and resource locations, a maritime map embedded in the landscape itself. Ritual practices often acknowledged the sea's central importance and danger, with evidence suggesting propitiatory offerings at significant maritime locations and specialized funerary treatments for those lost at sea. Even after the Norse political connection ended, these maritime adaptations persisted as fundamental aspects of island life, with fishing and seafaring techniques maintaining clear Norse influences into the modern era. The six-sareen and yole fishing boats used in Shetland until the early 20th century preserved Norse design elements adapted for local conditions, representing one of the most direct lines of cultural continuity across centuries of political and social change. The astronomical knowledge and temporal awareness of Norse communities reflected both practical necessities and cosmological understandings. In northern latitudes, the dramatic seasonal variations in daylight required sophisticated tracking of temporal patterns to coordinate agricultural activities and maritime ventures. Certain landscape features may have functioned as calendrical markers, with alignments to solstice sunrises or sunsets helping to calibrate the annual cycle. The Norse divided the year into two primary seasons, summer and winter, rather than the four familiar in classical traditions, with further subdivisions marked by natural phenomena and agricultural activities. This temporal framework structured taxation, legal proceedings, and community gatherings, with things typically held at established points in the annual cycle. Christian ecclesiastical time eventually overlaid these patterns, introducing saints' days and liturgical seasons as additional temporal markers. The resulting hybrid timekeeping system combined practical observation of natural phenomena with increasingly formalized calendrical structures, allowing communities to coordinate activities across both local and broader scales. The relationship with neighboring regions, mainland Scotland, the Hebrides, Ireland, and more distant Norse territories, shaped the distinctive development of the Northern Isles throughout the Norse period. Archaeological evidence indicates regular contact through trade goods, stylistic influences in material culture, and occasionally documentary mentions of political interactions or military campaigns. The Orkneyinga saga describes Northern Isles earls conducting expeditions to Ireland, mainland Scotland, and the Hebrides, sometimes seeking conquest and other times pursuing alliances. Marriage connections occasionally linked the earls with Scottish noble families, creating kinship networks that complicated political loyalties. The islands served as waypoints in maritime networks connecting Scandinavia with the British Isles and beyond, their strategic position ensuring regular contact with diverse cultural influences. This networked position, neither fully isolated nor completely integrated into any single political sphere, contributed to the development of the island's distinctive hybrid culture, incorporating elements from multiple traditions while maintaining their own particular synthesis. The ritual and ceremonial aspects of Norse life in the islands appear occasionally in the archaeological record, offering glimpses of how communities marked significant transitions and maintained cosmic order. Burial practices show considerable variation, with some individuals interred with grave goods according to pagan traditions, while others received Christian burial with east-west orientation and absence of grave goods. Certain landscape features appear to have served ritual functions, stones, mounds, or distinctive natural formations that became focuses for community practices. The transition to Christianity transformed these ritual patterns, with churches established as new ceremonial centers and Christian liturgical cycles replacing earlier seasonal observances. Yet folk practices incorporating elements from pre-Christian traditions persisted alongside official religion, creating a layered ritual landscape where multiple belief systems operated simultaneously in different contexts. Seasonal celebrations like Winter's Day and Summer's Day maintained ancient patterns of marking temporal transitions while incorporating new Christian elements. Even modern traditions like Up Helly AA, though largely Victorian inventions in their current form, draw upon and reimagine ritual aspects of the island's Norse past. The environmental impact of Norse settlement was substantial and long-lasting. Pollen records from peat bogs across the islands show increased clearance of remaining woodland during this period as settlers needed timber for construction, boat building, and fuel. The introduction of new agricultural practices altered erosion patterns, sometimes creating or accelerating soil degradation on marginal lands. Changes in farming emphasis, with the Norse focusing more intensively on barley cultivation and sheep herding than their predecessors, transformed the landscape in subtle but cumulatively significant ways. Marine resource exploitation patterns shifted, with certain fish species targeted more intensively than before. These environmental signatures provide a biological record of cultural change preserved in sediments and soils that can be read alongside more conventional archaeological evidence. Modern environmental challenges facing the islands, coastal erosion, changing marine ecosystems, shifts in weather patterns associated with climate change, create new contexts for interpreting this historical relationship between human communities and their environment. The cognitive world of the Norse settlers, their beliefs, values, and conceptual frameworks differed in significant ways from those of the indigenous population they displaced. Norse mythology envisioned a cosmos centered around Yggdrasil, the world tree, with 9 realms including Asgard, home of the gods, and Midgard, the human world. This cosmology informed daily practices and decisions, from the orientation of buildings to the timing of significant activities. Even after official Christianization, elements of this worldview persisted in folk practices and beliefs. Archaeological finds occasionally provide direct evidence of pagan religious activities, a Thor's hammer pendant from Skyle in Orkney, for instance, or burial practices consistent with Norse religious traditions. The discovery of a stone carved with an image possibly representing the god Odin at the Brug of Versailles suggests the existence of pagan shrines or sacred spaces during the early settlement period. The material culture of the Norse settlers reveals both continuity with their Scandinavian homeland and adaptation to their new environment. Pottery styles show distinctive Norse forms and decoration techniques. Tools maintain design features familiar from Norwegian examples while sometimes incorporating local materials. Personal adornment items, brooches, pins, arm rings, display characteristic Norse aesthetic principles with animal motifs and intricate interlace patterns. The persistence of these cultural markers across generations indicates the maintenance of a distinct identity rather than rapid assimilation into indigenous traditions. Yet innovation is evident as well, as settlers adjusted their practices to accommodate the particular conditions of their new island homes. Stone replaced wood as the primary building material due to local scarcity of timber. Fishing technologies were refined to target the specific species available in local waters. Clothing styles likely adapted to the island's climate while maintaining distinctive Norse elements. The experience of violence during the Norse period appears in various forms in the archaeological and historical record. The initial settlement phase likely involved direct conflict with indigenous populations, though the precise dynamics remain debated among scholars. Skeletal remains occasionally show trauma patterns consistent with interpersonal violence, defensive wounds on forearm bones, blade injuries to skulls, embedded projectile points. The sagas describe numerous violent episodes within Norse society itself, with blood feuds, power struggles between rival factions, and occasional external conflicts. Defensive structures at some settlement sites suggest ongoing security concerns even after initial establishment. The introduction of Christianity gradually modified attitudes toward violence, with the Church attempting to regulate conflict through religious sanctions and offering alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. The later Scottish administration brought new forms of structural violence through exploitative taxation and labor demands, particularly under the Stuart Earls, generating significant resistance from island communities attempting to preserve traditional rights. These varied experiences of violence, from dramatic military encounters to more subtle forms of coercion and resistance, formed significant aspects of historical experience that shaped cultural development across centuries. The artistic expressions of Norse settlers in the Northern Isles combined traditional Scandinavian elements with innovations responding to local materials and influences. Stone carving continued traditions established in the Pictish period, but incorporated distinctively Norse motifs and composition principles. Metalwork displays the intricate animal styles characteristic of Viking Age art, with sinuous beasts intertwining in complex patterns that seem almost to move before the viewer's eye. Bone and antler carving produced both practical items and decorative pieces that reveal skilled craftsmanship and aesthetic sensibility. Textile art, though rarely preserved in archaeological contexts, is occasionally mentioned in documentary sources, and likely represented a significant artistic domain primarily associated with women's work. After Christianization, artistic production increasingly incorporated religious themes while maintaining distinctive stylistic approaches derived from Norse traditions. The magnificent architectural achievement of St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall, begun in the 12th century, represents the culmination of this process. A structure built according to international Romanesque principles, but incorporating decorative elements and symbolic references that reflect the island's particular cultural synthesis. The economic networks connecting the Northern Isles to wider trading systems expanded significantly during the Norse period. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals imported goods from diverse sources: pottery from England and the Rhineland, glass from continental Europe, coins from various kingdoms including occasional Islamic dirhams, amber from the Baltic region. The islands exported local products including fish, particularly dried cod, which could be transported long distances, wool and woolen textiles, and soapstone items quarried in Shetland. This participation in long-distance exchange brought not just material goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. The Northern Isles, despite their seemingly remote location, were integrated into medieval Europe's commercial networks and exposed to its cultural currents. Archaeological evidence for craft specialization, workshops dedicated to particular activities like metalworking or textile production, suggests economic complexity beyond simple subsistence farming, with certain settlements developing proto-urban characteristics that facilitated trade and specialized production. The architectural evolution of Norse settlements in the Northern Isles reflects both cultural identity and adaptation to local conditions. Early Norse buildings closely resembled their Scandinavian counterparts, long rectangular structures with slightly curved walls, central hearths, and internal divisions creating separate areas for human habitation, animal housing, and storage. As settlement progressed, these designs were adapted to use locally available materials, primarily stone rather than timber, and address the specific climatic challenges of the islands. Later medieval structures show increasing Scottish influence in design elements while maintaining certain Norse characteristics. Elite buildings like the Bishop's Palace in Kirkwall and the Earl's Bew at Orfeer demonstrate how high-status architecture incorporated both local traditions and international styles, appropriate to the status of their occupants. Ordinary farmhouses evolved more gradually, maintaining practical features suited to the agricultural and climatic conditions of the islands regardless of changing political affiliations or elite cultural preferences. This architectural record provides a material indication of how Norse cultural identity persisted yet evolved over centuries of settlement, showing both conservatism in maintaining traditional forms and flexibility in adapting to new influences and requirements. The psychological experience of living in the Northern Isles during the Norse period would have been shaped by the distinctive rhythms of island life in northern latitudes. The extreme seasonal variations in daylight, from the near-constant illumination of midsummer to the brief dim days of midwinter, created fundamentally different experiential realities at different points in the year. Isolation during winter months, when storms could prevent travel, between islands or to external regions for weeks at a time, contrasted with intensive social interaction and maritime activity during summer. The constant presence of the sea as both resource and threat required psychological adaptation to its rhythms and dangers. Community bonds likely served crucial functions in this context, providing mutual support through challenging conditions and collective celebration during more abundant periods. The gradual religious transition from paganism to Christianity represented not just external observance changes but profound psychological reorientation as fundamental understandings of cosmic order, afterlife expectations, and moral frameworks shifted. Later, political transitions similarly required psychological adaptation as allegiances, identities, and relationship networks realigned in response to changing external conditions. The fate of the indigenous Pictish population during the Norse settlement period remains one of the most debated aspects of this historical transition. Earlier interpretations often emphasized violent displacement or elimination, while more recent scholarship suggests a more complex process involving some combination of conflict, assimilation, intermarriage, and emigration to mainland Scotland. Genetic evidence for modern populations indicates biological continuity with pre-Norse inhabitants alongside substantial Norse contribution, confirming that complete population replacement did not occur. The rapid disappearance of distinctive Pictish cultural markers, symbol stones, circular house forms, pottery styles, suggests significant social disruption rather than peaceful integration, though the precise mechanisms remain unclear. The apparent gender imbalance in the initial Norse settler population, with more men than women making the journey from Scandinavia, creates conditions where intermarriage with indigenous women would have been demographically advantageous, potentially preserving certain maternal cultural transmissions, while paternal lineages and associated cultural patterns became predominantly Norse. This complex demographic transition produced a population with mixed genetic heritage, but overwhelmingly Norse cultural identification within a relatively short time frame. The technological adaptations developed by Norse settlers in the Northern Isles represent significant achievements in human environmental response. Boat-building techniques evolved to address the particularly challenging waters around the islands, with design features optimized for local conditions while maintaining core principles derived from Scandinavian traditions. Agricultural practices were modified to accommodate the island's soil types, drainage patterns, and growing season limitations, creating sustainable food production systems that supported substantial populations for centuries. Fishing technologies show remarkable specialization, with different equipment designed for various target species and fishing environments. Building methods adapted Norwegian architectural principles to use locally available materials, particularly stone, creating structures that effectively addressed the island's climatic challenges. These technological systems, refined over generations through practical experience and knowledge transmission, demonstrate the remarkable human capacity for environmental adaptation and cultural creativity in response to challenging conditions. The process of Christianization transformed Norse society in the Northern Isles across multiple dimensions. Traditional accounts suggest that Olaf Tryggvason of Norway pressured Earl Sigurd the Stout to accept baptism around 995 CE, but archaeological evidence indicates a more gradual process. Early Christian artifacts appear alongside pagan items in some contexts, suggesting a period of religious syncretism rather than abrupt change. Small chapels were established on various islands, often adjacent to existing settlements, rather than replacing them. By the mid-11th century, Christianity had clearly become the dominant faith, with Earl Thorfinn the Mighty establishing a bishop's seat at Versailles. The construction of St. Magnus Cathedral in the 12th century represents the culmination of this process, a monumental statement of Christian identity that nonetheless incorporated elements of Norse cultural expression in its architecture and decoration. Christianity connected the islands more firmly to wider European cultural currents while providing a framework for new forms of power and organization. Yet folk practices incorporating elements from pre-Christian traditions persisted alongside official religion, creating a layered belief system where multiple worldviews operated simultaneously in different contexts. The veneration of St. Magnus, assassinated around 11 and 15 CE, illustrates the complex intersection of religion, politics, and identity in the Christian Norse earldom. Magnus Erlendsson, who ruled as co-earl with his cousin Håkon, refused to participate in a Viking expedition to Wales, citing his Christian principles, an early indication of changing values within the Norse elite. His subsequent murder, orchestrated by Håkon, initially seemed merely another episode in the violent power struggles typical of the period. However, reports of miraculous healings at his grave led to his recognition as a saint, providing the islands with a local holy figure who combined Norse aristocratic lineage with Christian martyrdom. His nephew Rognvald Kali Kolsson used devotion to Magnus to legitimize his own claim to the earldom, promising to build a magnificent stone church in his uncle's honor. The resulting cathedral became the spiritual center of the islands and remains the most impressive physical legacy of the Norse period. The cult of St. Magnus represented a distinctively Orcadian expression of Christianity, incorporating elements of Norse cultural identity within a Christian framework. The political relationship between the earldom of Orkney and the Norwegian crown evolved significantly over time, reflecting both local dynamics and broader geopolitical shifts. The sagas describe Harold Fairhair's initial campaign to extend his authority over Norse settlements in the West, though modern historians question the historical accuracy of these accounts. More reliable evidence indicates that by the 11th century, the earls acknowledged Norwegian overlordship while maintaining substantial practical autonomy. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and later Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, occasionally intervened directly in earldom affairs, particularly in efforts to promote Christianization. King Magnus Barefoot's expedition to the west in 1098 reasserted Norwegian authority more forcefully, resulting in the deposition of existing earls and appointment of new ones loyal to the crown. The marriage of Earl Ragnvald Kalli Kolsson's daughter to the Norwegian King Eystein in the 12th century created kinship ties between the ruling houses, potentially strengthening the connection while simultaneously giving the earls greater status and influence. This complex relationship, balancing royal authority against practical realities of distance and local power structures, continued until the 15th century transfer of the islands to Scottish control. The linguistic evolution in the Northern Isles during and after the Norse period reveals much about cultural identity and power relationships. Place name evidence suggests near-complete replacement of Pictish toponyms with Norse ones. Words ending in Vik, bay, Ness, headland, by, farm, Styr, dwelling, and Bister, farm, still dot the landscape today, creating a geography that can be read through Viking eyes. Personal names recorded in later medieval documents show overwhelming Norse influence, with Scandinavian naming patterns persisting long after political connections with Norway had diminished. The Norn language itself, a West Norse dialect closely related to Faroese and Icelandic, survived as the everyday speech of the islands until the 18th century, gradually retreating before Scots but leaving distinctive imprints on local dialects that persist today. Words like Piri, small, scary, a rocky islet, and muckle, large, entered everyday speech, while maritime and agricultural terminology maintained particularly strong Norse influences. This linguistic trajectory from complete dominance to gradual erosion and finally to fragmentary preservation within another language mirrors the broader cultural transition from Norse to Scottish identity, while preserving elements that continue to distinguish the islands from mainland Scotland. For modern inhabitants of the Northern Isles, Norse heritage represents one layer in a complex identity shaped by multiple historical influences. Some embrace Viking ancestry with enthusiasm, seeing it as a distinctive element that distinguishes island culture from mainstream Scottish identity. Others maintain a more measured relationship with this aspect of local history, perhaps emphasizing more recent cultural developments or connections to Scottish traditions. The political implications of this heritage occasionally surface in debates about constitutional status and governance arrangements. During the Scottish independence referendum campaign of 2014, some voices in both Orkney and Shetland suggested that if Scotland separated from the United Kingdom, the islands might seek their own arrangements, rather than automatically following the Scottish mainland into independence. Though such proposals gained limited traction, they reflect an ongoing sense that the island's distinctive historical trajectory might justify special consideration in governance arrangements. The story of the Norse in the Northern Isles ultimately transcends simple narratives of conquest and replacement. It represents a complex process through which human communities adapt to new circumstances, both environmental and social. The Norse who arrived as raiders and became settlers were themselves transformed by the islands they occupied, developing a distinctive identity, neither identical to their Scandinavian origins nor fully aligned with neighboring Scottish culture. The indigenous Pictish population, though demographically overshadowed, contributed genetic material and perhaps cultural elements to this emerging society. The resulting synthesis, further modified by centuries of subsequent influences, produced the unique character of Orkney and Shetland that persists today. For the Pictish inhabitants who witnessed the initial Norse incursions, the realization that these were not merely raiders, but permanent settlers indeed, came too late to preserve their independent cultural trajectory. Yet their descendants, genetically, if not culturally, continued to inhabit the islands, incorporated into a new social order that ultimately proved remarkably durable. For the Norse settlers who established that new order, the later transition to Scottish control represented another historical inflection point, though one implemented through political arrangements rather than demographic replacement. Both transformations remind us that what appears permanent in human affairs often proves temporary when viewed across sufficient timescales. Standing today on the wind-scoured headlands of these northern islands, watching waves crash against shores that have witnessed countless arrivals and departures, one senses the temporal depth that underlies seemingly permanent arrangements. Cultures rise and fall, political boundaries shift, languages evolve or disappear. Yet human communities persist, adapting to changing circumstances while carrying forward elements of earlier traditions. The Norse chapter in the island story, a period when one people saw another approaching and realized too late that their world was changing forever, offers a powerful reminder that what we experience as solid and unchanging is often merely a moment in a longer historical process, a temporary arrangement in the ongoing human negotiation with environment, resources, and power. As we conclude this exploration of the Viking takeover of Scotland's Northern Isles, we are left with the haunting image of those Pictish observers on the cliffs, watching as dragon-prowed ships approach their shores. In their faces, anxious, curious, perhaps resigned, we might recognize something of our own condition. We too stand at the confluence of historical currents, witnessing transformations whose full implications may only become clear to future generations. The Picts saw too late that their world was changing irreversibly. In their story, perhaps we might find both caution and comfort. Caution about the fragility of established orders, comfort in the remarkable resilience of human communities that adapt, endure, and ultimately create new syntheses from the collision of different worlds. Their experience echoes across the centuries, reminding us that we too are merely moments in time's longer arc, participants in historical processes that began long before us and will continue long after our own brief chapter has closed.